The Trump administration's controversial Remain in Mexico policy may be illegal. That's according to some officials. Well, the number of asylum seekers being returned to Mexico has skyrocketed by nearly 36,000 in the span of just a few months. A person seeking asylum is unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of persecution or fear of persecution. And under law, those people have the right to protection in the United States. Molly O'Toole has been reporting on this extensively and joins me now from Washington. She's an immigration reporter for the LA Times. So, Molly, thank you first off for joining me. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 says that government can't discriminate. They can't discriminate based on race, based on sex, nationality, birthplace, or even where you live. So does this Remain in Mexico policy contradict that law?
Well, there are a number of ways in which officials have argued, and other experts, advocates, lawyers, that this policy that's better known as Remain in Mexico, the administration refers to it as Migrant Protection Protocols. Their original name was Remain in Mexico. A number of ways in which it violates the INA, which is the law that you mentioned that's sort of the foundation of the U.S. immigration system. One argument is that it does discriminate because at least until June, it was only Central American asylum seekers who were being subject to this policy. Now that's been expanded to all Spanish speakers, which is another argument that could be another form of discrimination. It also, the INA sort of enshrines these fundamental principles, international law and domestic law, that you can't return someone to harm. And that's a really fundamental argument that people are making against this policy because there are many documented cases in which the asylum seekers under this program are being returned to harm. And then another aspect is whether or not they're actually their rights to due process are being abridged under this policy because of some of these technicalities that are really making it very, very difficult for them to actually win or even see through their asylum case in the U.S. while they wait in Mexico.
So, Molly, ultimately, is this policy illegal?
Well, it's not necessarily a call for me to make, but what we found after it's a months-long investigation from all across the border, more than 40 interviews with U.S. and Mexican officials, current and former, lawyers, judges, the asylum seekers themselves, the sort of testimony of their experience is that in implementing this policy, the Trump administration officials at the Department of Homeland Security do appear to be violating the law. Now, the bigger question as to whether the policy is illegal, that is a subject of ongoing litigation. In October, the Ninth Circuit will be hearing arguments on the legality of the policy. Thus far, it was blocked by one judge, and then the following month, the Ninth Circuit allowed it to move forward, but that wasn't a ruling on its legality. And two of the three judges on that panel expressed serious concerns about the policy and that question in and of itself.
So, Molly, ultimately, if you're coming to the U.S. and you want to seek asylum, how do you prove that you're possibly being persecuted or the fear of persecution?
Well, it's very, very difficult. And the administration tends to point to the fact that there are sort of debating numbers about this, but that only a very low percentage of asylum seekers ultimately win their asylum claim. The administration points to that to say, well, most of these claims are fraudulent. Now, advocates and lawyers on the other side will say, well, no, that just proves how difficult it is to win asylum in the U.S. and that potentially the U.S. asylum system, U.S. immigration law, has been outdated for the current factors that are contributing to the migration that we see. So a vast majority of people coming to the border are coming from Central America, what's referred to as the Northern Triangle region. That's El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Many of them are fleeing a very complex combination of poverty, of corruption, of gang violence, domestic violence. There's some of the highest rates of femicide in the world. And so it's very difficult to win your asylum case. But when you do come to the border, generally speaking, before this policy, you're given a credible fear interview, which is sort of the first step in this long process. And Congress initially set credible fear standard to be very low because they were trying to avoid violating that legal principle that we talked about, avoid returning someone to harm. And so most people do pass their credible fear interview, and then they go into this very lengthy process that could potentially take years. The average processing time for an immigration case right now, it's just under 2 years.
So ultimately, Molly, the Remain in Mexico policy, it'll be up for congressional debate in October. But until then, it remains in place. Do you have a sense, now that you've traveled there and spoken to these people, do you have a sense of where this policy is going?
It's hard to say. I mean, the 2 out of the 3 judges on the Ninth Circuit Appeals Court panel did express serious concerns with the policy, alluding to its legality, though they weren't ruling on that at the time. One judge said that it was an impossible reading of the immigration law, that the government's argument for this policy was an impossible reading. Another one said that the procedures to implement this policy, which is some of what we reported on, that they were so counter to the stated goal of the policy, which is the migrant protection, as to be arbitrary and capricious. So that does seem to indicate that there are serious concerns about the legality. But once again, this is a pattern in which the Trump administration is rolling out a policy that's intended to deter asylum seekers, to restrict immigration, and then essentially leaving it up to the courts to decide. So actually, Congress has had very little role to play in this ongoing debate with the administration's effort to restrict immigration, even potentially outside of what the lawmakers initially intended the law to do.
A lot to watch in the courts coming up in the coming months. I want to thank you as well, Molly O'Toole with the LA Times, for joining us.